Good morning, everyone, and welcome to session 16 on combating racism, xenophobia, intolerance, and discrimination. My name is Christy Edwards. I'm the deputy head of the Tolerance and Non-Discrimination Department here at ODIHR. And I'd like to welcome everyone. I do want to note that the speakers list for this session is still open, so if you'd like to sign up, please see my colleague directly behind me. And please note that the speakers can only take the floor in the capacity in which you're registered, and only entities registered on the speakers list can be represented. I'd like to give a few words of introduction to our topic for this morning, specifically on combating racism, xenophobia, intolerance, and discrimination. And some of the questions that our introducers will address this morning include how are participating states ensuring the implementation of the OSCE Ministerial Council Decision 909 and other decisions related to preventing and responding to hate crimes and discrimination, the progress made by participating states in strengthening a comprehensive approach to addressing hate crimes and in identifying and implementing good practices. So I'd also like to remind everyone that, as always, seats in the HDIM plenary hall are designated and as indicated on signs placed around the table. All participants are kindly asked throughout the session to respect this seating arrangement. Live streaming of the session is available, and filming with cameras and video cameras is not permitted. No other audiovisual recordings should be undertaken without the explicit permission of the individuals being filmed. Please be reminded that it is expected in interventions that you present in a meaningful, orderly, and respectful manner. And we kindly ask participants to submit your statements before the session to the interpreters and preferably to the distribution desk to ensure that the flow of documents reflect the discussion. The statements should be provided to the documentation desk in front of the plenary hall. And also I'll note that the speaker's biographical information, or the introducer's biographical information, will be displayed on the screens. So I'll now turn the floor over to our first introducer, Philippe Leclerc from the UNHCR in Greece.
Well, thank you very much. Good morning. It is a great honor to participate in the OSCE Human Dimension Implementation meeting and to share the experience UNHCR has had in Greece in combating hate crime. Such efforts, which started in 2011, continue to develop in a context where Greece received more than 1 million refugees and migrants since summer 2015 and hosts, as we speak, almost 70,000 asylum seekers and refugees since that time. Racism, xenophobia, and intolerance are common root causes of persecution and flight and can threaten asylum seekers and refugees throughout their displacement. In countries of asylum, racism and intolerance can be manifested through restricted access to asylum or negatively affecting the quality of asylum, lack of public support for reception systems for asylum seekers, restricted access to public services, and barriers in the integration of recognized refugees and enjoyment of their full rights. In addition, racism and xenophobia threaten social cohesion, democratic values, and the rule of law, while they constitute direct violations of the core principles upon which the United Nations are founded. The particular vulnerability of asylum seekers and refugees to racist and xenophobic attitudes is an ongoing issue that needs to be addressed, particularly in the context of increased focus on mixed migration flows in the European Union and the rise of anti-foreigners movements. The necessary public support for the reception of asylum seekers and refugees continues to be hindered by the tendency of certain narratives to confound concerns over irregular migration with those of refugee movements. UNHCR has developed a strategic approach to guide our offices around the world on how to contribute in countering such phenomenon, aiming at enhancing refugee protection that entails the following elements. First, monitoring the signs of racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, and tracking and reporting hate crimes. Second, analyzing the underlying reasons. Third, assessing the manifestations of these phenomena and their impact on protection. Fourth, understanding legal obligations to protect all individuals from racial discrimination and multiple forms of discrimination. 5, engaging a network of diverse organizations and actors that implement complementary activities targeting different groups in society. 6, including affected communities in the strategic approach and providing individual support to victims. Based on this strategic approach, in 2011, UNHCR in Greece took the initiative, jointly with the Greek National Commission for Human Rights, for the establishment of a racist violence recording network, RVRN, following two major findings. The first, the absence of an official and effective data collection system on hate crime, and the need for coordination among organizations which provided services to victims of racist violence and hate crimes. Today, the RVRN in Greece is comprised of 45 actors offering medical, social, and legal services, or in coming in direct contact with victims of racist violence or victims of other hate or bias-motivated violent attacks, as well as organizations established by the groups which are usually targeted by racist violence themselves: refugees, migrants, LGBTI persons. The RVRN provided all participating actors with a solid and widely approved methodology of recording. It has published 7 annual reports providing the fullest assessment of hate crime quality trends in Greece. Findings are publicized and widely disseminated. Apart from its contribution in making hate crimes visible and in promoting legislation combating hate crime in practice, the RVRN was invited by the investigating authorities, in particular the prosecutors, to actively contribute to the investigation of various criminal acts. Institutional recognition of its effectiveness has been reflected in the composition of the newly established National Council Against Racism and Intolerance, under the auspices of the Ministry of Justice, in which 2 representatives of the RVRN participates. From the early beginning of this process, OSCE ODIHR have been a valuable partner. ODIHR's reports on legislation and data collection of hate crimes have contributed to the establishment of the RVRN, working methods and positions. The RVRN, with the ODIHR, have organized 2 trainings on hate crime for the RVRN members, and more are to come. During these years, the RVRN has exchanged regularly with the OSCE. It submits annually its data to ODIHR and contributes to its efforts. The RVRN has been invited on several occasions to share key elements of its successful coalition practices. ODIHR has encouraged UNHCR to build similar conditions in other countries and promote the RVRN model as a best practice example. Yes, Mrs. Secretary General of the Ministry of Justice, you can be proud of the Greek example in this field. We are currently looking into the possibility to replicate the RVRN model in a neighboring country, Bulgaria, and it has been with great satisfaction that the RVRN participates actively in the implementation of the program, building a comprehensive criminal justice response to hate crime, funded by the European Commission and implemented by OSCE ODIHR in several countries, including Greece. An agreement was officially signed last June by the Ministry of Justice, the Ministry of Interior, the Prosecutor of the Supreme Court, the President of the Supreme Court, the Ministry of Citizen Protection, the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Migration Policy, and the National School of Justice and the OSCE National Contact Point on Hate Crime for Greece and the RVRN. This agreement strengthens the cooperation between the state authorities and international organizations with expertise on hate crimes and constitute a positive step in seeking continuously victim-centered services with the assistance of the CSOs. The RVRN has quickly identified and advocated gaps in access to justice for victims of hate crimes. Filing a complaint or reporting a hate crime committed against undocumented migrants and asylum seekers implied the risk of detention and deportation due to lack of residence status. This gap has been addressed by provisions on the protection of victims and essential witnesses for providing for the suspension of detention and deportation decisions, as well as the establishment of a special regime of residence permit during the trial. Building bridges between police, judicial authorities, and victims has been our continuous objective. For this purpose, the RVRN maintains a cooperative contact with the Department of Combating Racist Violence and shares information on support services provided by the RVRN members. This practice has been quite successful, as victims are supported by NGOs, and some practical gaps of the police, such as the lack of psychological support, are mitigated. One of the major challenges still remaining is facilitating access to recording, reporting, and support services for victims of hate crimes within communities. Our recordings demonstrate that crimes on the ground of religion, sexual orientation, and gender identity committed within the communities are underreported due to a lack of adequate support services and fear of reprisals. Our findings allow us to believe that tailored programs should be designed by state authorities to meet the specific needs of vulnerable persons within the communities. It is clear that concerted efforts are required from all concerned parties, states, the United Nations, and other international and regional organizations, as well as NGOs and community groups, to address these issues. The success of any such effort will be directly proportional to the political will of states to put in place systems for the protection of basic rights and mechanisms for ensuring their effective implementation. This needs to be complemented by activities aimed at preventing racist and intolerant attitudes from developing, such as human rights education and public information campaigns to promote respect and tolerance. In conclusion, racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance constitute a serious threat to the overall protection environment for internally displaced, asylum seekers, stateless persons, and refugees. UNHCR and its partners at local, national, regional, and global levels are working hard to tackle this protection challenge, but more needs to be done, and we count on all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and we of course appreciate the partnership of UNHCR in our work as well. Before I hand the floor over to our next introducer, I also wanted to just remind the audience that we still have room on the speakers list, so if you're still interested in signing up, please see my colleague sitting behind me. Next, I'd like to turn over the floor to Nikica Hammer-Vidmar, the head of the Service for Victim and Witness Support in the Ministry of Justice in Croatia. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello. I'm honored to be here and share Croatian experiences and good practice, and I will refer on possibility of cooperation between government bodies and civil society organizations. The most important mechanism that can strengthen comprehensive response by the governments and civil society is mutual cooperation between them in combating racism, xenophobia, intolerance, and discrimination. Cooperation is possible if there is a mutual respect and acceptance, and when there are common goals that all want to achieve, including honest desire for change and development. In that process, progress is possible if there is a sincere commitment to take action, if stakeholders have knowledge, experience, and education, and expertise in the atmosphere of open, respectful, and trustful communication. Cooperation is possible if there is a mutual trust, but the question is, how can we build the trust? It can be built if there is open and professional relationship and communication, if there are present general positive mutual experiences. Trust exists and be built if there are no mutual prejudices. Common goals and shared values and principles strengthen cooperation and can be a bridge for mutual understanding and better cooperation. In the domain of victim help and support, common goals for both government and civil society can be aspiration for society or community free of any form of discrimination and respect each individual. Common principles and values can be a victims empowering approach, empathic, holistic, humanistic, and non-discriminating approach, provision of help and support to victims according to their needs or individualized approach. Through the process of cooperation, it's necessary to discuss needs and expected objectives, standardize the procedures, and define activities through professional approach. Many times, initiatives, ideas, and new approaches survive and develop only because there are some devoted professionals in civil society, but also in government bodies. Some individuals that believe in their ideas, many times without proper support, but with huge energy devoted and dedicated to their goals and devoted to their desire for change and driven by their activism. Good example of good practice between the government body and civil society organizations in Croatia is shown through the scope of work of the Government Office for Human Rights and Rights of National Minorities that actively cooperates with civil society in different ways, such as together with representatives of civil society, as members of working group, they delivered the National Plan for Combating Discrimination, with accompanying action plan for implementation of the national plan. In the action plan, there are stipulated some measures for which the provision of cooperation with civil society organizations is needed and planned. Joint activities are campaigns directed to fighting discrimination and hate crime, organization of roundtables of subject of discrimination, hate crime and hate speech, and monitoring the implementation. Government's Human Rights Office also stipulated cooperation between public institutions and civil society organizations regarding the hate crime in the protocol for procedure in case of hate crime, in a way that Human Rights Office is a main body for cooperation with civil society organizations. They count on civil society organizations as those organizations that will encourage victims to report cases of hate crime with the assurance of safety. And in order to provide the best possible prosecutions of a specific case, cooperation shall be established with stakeholders who, in a specific case of hate crime, may provide assistance, for example, civil society organizations, religious communities, and experts dealing with this issue. Also, a very important way of cooperation with civil society organizations is implemented through the work of the Hate Crime Monitoring Working Group. It is an intersection body coordinated by the Government's Office for Human Rights and the Rights of the National Minorities. Representatives of civil society organizations are regular members of this working group. The Hate Crimes Monitoring Working Group focuses on hate crime data collection and related laws and processes. It also coordinates interinstitutional cooperation and cooperation with civil society organizations in relation to hate crime prevention. Monitoring group includes a wide range of key stakeholders, such as representatives of Ministry of Interior, Public Attorney's Office, and Ministry of Justice. These are the key institutions in the identification and prosecution of hate crime cases. Furthermore, the monitoring group includes representatives of Ombudsman Office, Ministry of International and European Affairs, Higher Misdemeanor Court, the Municipal Court, Faculty of Law, and as I already mentioned, civil society organization. It's one organization called Center for Peace Studies. The working group holds meetings several times a year, providing an opportunity for members to exchange data on hate crime and to discuss cases, trends, and future initiatives. A monitoring group is also recognized as the best practice example by EU Agency for Fundamental Rights. Also, they monitor the implementation of the Code of Conduct on countering illegal hate speech, and its monitoring is performed in cooperation with civil society organizations. There are a number of ways in which civil society organizations can collaborate with public institutions in order to create a comprehensive approach to hate crime. Some examples and good practice in Croatia are public bodies and organizations can jointly organize and attend trainings and workshops in order to build trust, exchange experience and best practices. Those trainings are organized by Police Academy, Judicial Academy, for judges, prosecutor officers, victim support professionals. And those trainings include the TACKLE program by ODIHR. Community leaders and organizations can establish personal contact with police officers in order for them to be better informed and understand the needs of the community and increase their trust in law enforcement. A group of civil society organizations reports hate crime to ODIHR on a yearly basis, sharing common methodology and thus sharing the info on the incidents of the proceedings. This serves as a shadow report on hate crimes and hate-related crimes in Croatia. Also, we developed a monitoring system of online hate speech and hate crime. There are also projects providing monitoring of court proceedings. Jointly participating in projects is also a very welcome initiative, and in such projects, civil societies and some government institutions as their partners can plan activities for planning strategies, guidelines, training programs, and different researches on victims' needs. Participation in different government working groups is also very welcomed and a good initiative. Those working groups usually deliver some very important documents, protocols, and national plans. And there are some possibility for joint actions also. We have some example. In one county there is one network. It's a network for psychosocial support that gathers the different 7 organizations, including victim support departments at the court, Center for Social Service, Anonymous Women's House, Children's Home, different NGOs, and police department. There are some projects delivering capacities of organizations for human rights mainstreaming. Their goal is to develop capacity for constructive participation and substantial contribution to policy development processes from a human rights point of view. Also, good practice that we have is done by the Ministry of Justice, that is providing financial support to civil society organizations that are gathered in the network for victim and witness support. Some other practical activities that may be very interested from the side of the civil society organizations. When hate crimes is reported, organization can assist victim when reporting the violence to a public institution, offer legal support, primary psychosocial support, and accompany victim to police station, court, Center for Social Service as a person of trust. And it is defined in the Criminal Procedure Act. This system provides a friendly mediator between victim and institutions. Some good practice from the side of the police, according to the notification of the rights of victims of crime. The notification on the rights of victims of crime is a handout given to the victim during the first contact with the police officers, containing information about their rights and all relevant contacts, including contact of victim witness support departments at the courts, NGOs providing victim support, and contact of National Call Center for Victims of Crime and Misdemeanor. It's number 116006. It's very beneficial for the victims to have all the information relevant to them communicated in different ways and information in written form. And it's shown to be very useful. Also, one very good practice is done by the prosecutor officers, who also provide information to victims on their rights and refer victims to victim and witness support departments at the courts and National Call Center also. Also, we have this process of conduction of individual victims' needs assessment. It's done by the police, prosecutor officers, and the courts in order to provide protection measures during the criminal procedure. And there is also possibility for civil society organizations and they can provide additional information on victims' needs. And those information and recommendations have to be considered by the mentioned bodies who provide individual assessment. And all those is regulated by the Criminal Procedure Act, Ordinance on Conduction of Individual Needs Assessment, and it's in line with the Victims Directive. I hope that some of those examples were interesting for you, and I'm very happy to participate in a discussion. Thank you.
I'd like to take the opportunity to thank both of our introducers today for the excellent examples that they've given on mechanisms to strengthen comprehensive responses to hate crime by both governments and civil society organizations. At this time, I'd like to now open the floor for the speakers list. As in previous sessions, the order of the previous, current, and next speaker will be displayed on the screens above all of your heads. The speaking time is limited to 4 minutes for this session. And I'd like to remind the participants to please keep your comments brief and to the point, preferably first listing recommendations. Criticism is of course welcome, but should be constructive. Participants are not encouraged to read lengthy prepared statements, but those can be submitted to the Document Distribution Center, which will then distribute them to all participants. And as per the rules of procedure for the OSCE, a representative raising a point of order may not speak on the substance of the matter under discussion. So I believe the speakers list will be coming up shortly. Great, so I'll then ask the first speaker to take the floor. Thank you.
Madam Chair, participants of the conference, allow me to start my statement by confirming that a mother tongue is the foundation of self-identification of any person. Consequently, one's attitude towards one's own mother tongue of ethnic minorities is a litmus test of how much ethnic groups trust each other and their support of human rights in the country. Multi-ethnic Russia and some countries in Europe where a majority of our countrymen live. For the Russian Federation, here a clear and significant policies to encourage and support ethnic languages have been developed. In July of 2018, the State Duma of the Russian Federation passed a law on teaching and learning one's mother tongue, which gives the opportunity to freely learn one's mother tongue in school. For over 20 years, I have professionally been dealing with cross-cultural heritage of peoples and personally participated in discussing this issue when the law was being drafted. I can unreservedly confirm that the passing of this law was based on broad preliminary consultations with ethnic minorities who live in the Russian Federation. Overmore, 2019 will be the year of the languages of indigenous peoples in Russia. In Russia, we have something like 276 ethnic minority languages in Russia, including Russian. The Russian Federation has consistently been developing in a policy of linguistic diversity, but for the distinctive character of all ethnic groups in Russia. We see something quite different in the Baltics and the Ukraine. For something like 15 years, the issue of maintaining linguistic diversity and maintaining the distinctive character of Russian speakers in these countries have steadily been eroding. There's been a clampdown and discrimination against our countrymen, going as far as prohibiting getting an education in one's mother tongue. In Latvia, the Russian speakers are taking daring measures to stop the arbitrary policies of the authorities to totally try to transfer all education to the Latvian languages. This also concerns private schools. Countermeasures, for example, the proposal of the ambassador in Russia, of Mr. Yermolayev in Latvia, to create consular schools met with aggression. This proposal was claimed by the Minister of Education and Science in Latvia as a ridiculous, and I quote, not based on any legal justification. I will note that no legal justification, but in contravention to international law. In Lithuania, recently, there have been submitted amendments to laws that claim that by 2023, Latvian education in schools for national minorities, for ethnic minorities in school, should reach 60% of all education. What is this if not discrimination and forced assimilation of Russian speakers? Also, what about the so-called preventive discussions with Russian-speaking students in Lithuania? What are they trying to prevent? Clearly, to prevent that young people should identify themselves as Russians. In Estonia, there is also ethnic intolerance against students learning in the Russian language. The Ukraine is also not far behind the Baltic states. The scandalous amendments of 2017 of the amendments to the law on education in Ukraine also have caused concern amongst Ukrainians and amongst neighboring countries. Following the example of Baltic states, Ukraine is also introducing a ban on using any language but Ukrainian language. The Russian language is doomed. This situation is unacceptable not only for Russian speakers, but for all other minorities. I would like to remind you that currently in Ukraine, there is something like 400,000 children learning in their mother tongues. There are over 15,000 schools in the country. 581 observe their education in Russian. I will conclude. We are concerned with the methods.
Speaker, will the next speaker please take the floor?
Merci, Madame la Modératrice. J'ai l'honneur de faire.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. It's my honor to make this statement on behalf of the European Union, with which the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, Liechtenstein, Moldova, Georgia, San Marino also associate themselves, and the full list will be submitted in writing. The European Union would like to make the following recommendations on combating racism, xenophobia, intolerance, and discrimination. Ensure that each individual can exercise without exception their fundamental human rights and freedoms, and that they have access to effective recourse in the event of discrimination or other violation of their rights and freedoms. To guarantee an inclusive approach in combating racism, xenophobia, intolerance, and discrimination based on the principles of the universality of human rights as enshrined in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights of 1948. To actively cooperate with the ODIHR and to fully support its activities in combating racism, xenophobia, intolerance, and discrimination. In this regard, we strongly encourage all participating states to provide to ODIHR all pertinent and relevant data in order to include this data in their annual report on hate crimes in the OSCE area, in keeping with commitments taken in the Athens decision of 2009 on combating hate crimes, to support and to bolster action by civil society and its contribution to preventing and combating racism, xenophobia, intolerance, and discrimination, to take all appropriate measures in order to improve the collection of statistics on hate crimes, specifically reporting and registering such crimes in order to improve knowledge of this phenomenon and to better evaluate actions of the police and justice bodies in combating hate crimes, and finally to foster learning about diversity, dialogue, and tolerance, and to counter prejudice by promoting human rights as well as inclusion and solidarity in society, specifically to mobilize youth so that they can contribute to combating intolerance and all forms of discrimination. Madam Moderator, the European Union was created based on the values of human dignity, equality, and the respect for human rights. Any attacks or crimes motivated by racism, xenophobia, intolerance, or discrimination based on disability, sexual orientation, or gender are an affront to the basic values of the European Union and of the OSCE. They not only harm the victim or those who identify with the victim, they harm all of humanity by undermining the necessary cohesion for the social contract of our modern societies. This is why any acts of intolerance or hate crimes must not go unpunished. We face two major challenges in this regard. First is the underreporting of these crimes. Today, many acts of intolerance which are racist and xenophobic in nature and many hate crimes cannot be prosecuted because they are not reported. Thus, they often remain invisible. The second is the use of the Internet in order to provide a vehicle for hateful and racist messages. The European Union has set up a legal instrument in this area with its framework decision of 2008 on fighting certain forms and manifestations of racism and xenophobia using criminal law, as well as its anti-discrimination directives of 2000 and the directive on the protection of victims. The European Union supports effective diagnosis through the agencies of fundamental rights. What is more, a high-level European Union group on racism, xenophobia, and other forms of intolerance was created in 2016 and held its fifth meeting in June of this year. The European Union calls upon all to continue this reflection within the OSCE on means for guaranteeing the effective implementation of our common commitments in combating racism, xenophobia, intolerance, and discrimination. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to give the floor to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. It is the position of the United States of America that there can be no room for hate crimes against anyone, anywhere, for any reason. States must meet such crimes with strong law enforcement response. The Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act of 2009 has enabled the United States Department of Justice to bring hate crimes charges in close to 200 cases over the past decade. This includes 32 convictions for hate crime offenses since January 2017 based on biased characteristics of race, religion, national origin, and sexual orientation. Attorney General Jeff Sessions called the conviction in April of 3 men who plotted to bomb the mosque and homes of Somali immigrants in Garden City, Kansas, quote, a significant victory against domestic terrorism and hate crimes, end quote. In May, a Kansas man was sentenced to life in prison for shooting 2 Indian nationals and a third person who tried to intervene, killing one of the victims. Last year, our nation was shocked when a neo-Nazi sympathizer drove his car into a crowd of protesters in Charlottesville, Virginia, resulting in the tragic death of activist Heather Heyer. We share the grief of those who mourned her death this year on the anniversary of her murder. On June 27, the perpetrator was charged with a hate crime act and racially motivated violent interference with a federally protected activity. As Attorney General Sessions said, this indictment should send a clear message to every would-be criminal in America that we aggressively prosecute violent crimes of hate that threaten the core principles of our nation. U.S. federal authorities work closely with civil society and state and local law enforcement across the country to provide training, outreach, and other tools to address hate crimes. This includes helping these organizations understand what constitutes a hate crime so that they can be investigated and prosecuted. Madam Moderator, last night I had the opportunity to engage with a wide range of civil society activists and leaders of African descent who have been here in Warsaw on a 2-day training program convened by ODIHR. During the discussion, I had the opportunity to learn firsthand how individuals of African descent representing a broad range of countries, the United States, Germany, UK, Hungary, Finland, Poland, Greece, Belgium, Ukraine, what they're doing to combat hate crimes, xenophobia, racism, discrimination, and how they're holding participating states, including the United States, accountable to our principles and commitments. Events like last night, that's what makes HDIM special. We have the opportunity to engage with civil society activists on equal footing and to engage in constructive discussions, including areas where we disagree, but in an open forum in a positive, constructive way. I'm very proud that so many of them are here today. HDIM is for you. It's a space where you have an opportunity to express your views and hold us accountable, and I look forward to hearing from you later on today. Finally, a shout out to ODIHR for convening this. I was proud to be representing a country that could contribute in a constructive way. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'd like to now pass the floor to the next speaker.
Distinguished participants of the meeting, I am Pripat Shubarov, a member of the Ukrainian Parliament and a representative of the Mejlis of the Crimean Tatar people. Ukraine is on the path of the European society, and casting aside the Soviet past, we have created an implementation possibility for our government to cast aside the racism and crimes on the basis of intolerance, which in Ukraine are especially important. The sustainable, stable Ukrainian nation has the military power in order to withstand the aggression from the Russian Federation. We must be open and honest. Perhaps we don't understand, of course we do, that when we talk about participating states of the organization violating principles contained in the Helsinki Final Act, it's very difficult to eradicate in our society the phenomenon of xenophobia and intolerance. You may be the judges. Beginning in February of 2014, the Russian Federation, within the framework of its relations with Ukraine, has violated all 10 Helsinki principles, and some of them, obviously, it has violated in a gross and glaring manner and continues to violate them, despite the they have also violated the memorandum on their commitments. With respect to the population of Crimean Tatars, they have suffered at the hands of the Russian occupying forces. This is nothing other than a crime, a hate crime, and a crime of intolerance. Ukraine, improving its national legislation, is attempting to eliminate hate crimes and at the same time calls upon participating states to join forces in order to stand up against Russian aggression against Ukraine and for the liberation of Ukrainian territories. Madam Chairperson, you have asked us to make recommendations which would allow us in future to unite our forces in fighting hate crimes. I do not think that we need to go very far beyond the OSCE to find these recommendations. Participants since 2014, beginning in February of 2014, after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, there have been 5 declarations: Baku, Helsinki, Tbilisi, Minsk, and Berlin. And none of these recommendations with respect to Russia's being called upon to respect international law, none of these have been fulfilled in order to ensure peace in Ukraine. None of these recommendations, specifically the end to the persecution of the Crimean Tatars, this has not been achieved. Distinguished participants, the main recommendation is that we be consistent in fulfilling the principles of our organization. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to pass the floor to the next speaker.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. The Holy See notes with alarm that Christians are the targets of hate crime across the OSCE region. Data collected and made available by the ODIHR indicate that anti-Christian hate crimes mainly and increasingly target places of worship, cemeteries, and other religious properties, even where Christians are in the majority. In addition, especially west of Vienna, certain sentiments and manifestations of intolerance and discrimination against Christians continue to exist as the last acceptable prejudice and seem to receive less attention than other forms of intolerance, presumably because of Christianity's position as the historically dominant religion. In this respect, it is important always to bear in mind that, as agreed by all participating states, victims of hate crimes may belong to both minority and majority communities. And as a white group statement highlighted in the closing plenary session of the Tirana-level Conference on Tolerance and Non-Discrimination, it has become outdated to talk about minority and majority religions, since all religions or beliefs are concerned, often in ways that go unnoticed. On the other hand, too often the term minorities is used as a synonym of victims, as if the victims could belong only to minority groups. Moreover, since in several jurisdictions, crimes against property are considered less serious than those against persons, there is both the risk of underreporting and reluctance to investigate and prosecute such crimes. Therefore, hate crimes against Christians are likely more numerous than those indicated in the annual reporting of the ODIHR and deserve greater attention. With specific regard to the respect and protection for places of worship and religious sites, it is also important to recall that participating states have already committed themselves to endeavor to prevent and protect against attacks directed at persons or groups based on faith, conscience, religion, or belief, and to adopt policies to promote respect and protection for places of worship and religious sites, religious monuments, cemeteries, and shrines against vandalism and destruction. The Holy See, while once more applauding the ODIHR's document on understanding anti-Semitic hate crimes and addressing of the security needs of Jewish communities, and the drafting of a paper on understanding hate crimes against Muslims and addressing the security needs of Muslim communities, remains confident that benefiting from the expertise derived from these guidelines and in accordance with the common approach in addressing all forms of religious intolerance and discrimination without improper or hierarchical selectivity, the ODIHR will also draft guidelines on understanding hate crimes against Christians and addressing the security needs of Christian communities. Finally, my delegation wishes to underline the importance of data collection in order to understand and address hate crimes. The website, laudably managed by the ODIHR, is an important tool, but underreporting and underrecording limit its effectiveness. In particular, the Holy See wishes to recall that in accordance with Ministerial Decision 909, the national points of contact are called upon to collect, maintain, and make public disaggregated data on hate crimes perpetrated against members of different religions. That said, the recommendations of our delegation are the following: to the participating states, to carefully record hate crimes committed against religious properties, to fully implement their commitment to adopt policies to promote respect and protection of our places of worship, to provide disaggregated data on hate crimes, paying greater attention to the hate crimes against Christians, while to the OSCE ODIHR to develop and strengthen capacity building activities with regard to the protection of religious properties, including Christian ones, and to train law enforcement agencies, criminal justice system professionals, and civil society to consider carefully also the hate crimes perpetrated against majority religious communities. Thank you, Madam Moderator.
Thank you. I'd like to give the floor now to the next speaker.
Thank you, Mrs. Moderator. Distinguished representatives, starting from our suggestions, it should be made clear to the Albanian government and elsewhere that they must respect the national Greek minority in Albania and pass this message to all the citizens of the country. It is an everyday phenomenon everywhere in the villages and in the cities of the Greek minority for Albanians to reprimand Greeks because they communicate with each other in Greek language. For the past 2 years, a nationalist group calling itself the Movement for the Great Albania, headed by Tahir Veliu, is attacking towns and villages in northern Epirus, where they lower the Greek flag from monuments, public buildings, and private residences, and then they desecrate them. Veliu's group is filming their action and posts them to the social media from where the Albanian media reproduce them. The Albanian police, apart from bringing Tahir Veliu in only once for a simple questioning, let him continue with his acts undisturbed. Another unresolved issue for many years is the street signs along the Kakavia-Argyrokastro highway, which crosses the Greek minority municipality of Dropolis and elsewhere. These street signs, written in Greek, as it is internationally established right for every national minority for the places they reside. However, they are being constantly destroyed and vandalized with racist anti-Greek slogans. Unfortunately, the Albanian authorities have failed to do anything. They have not conducted any inquiry, nor have they arrested any of the criminals. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to pass the floor to the next speaker.
Distinguished colleagues, we would like to point to a certain number of facts that are linked to the topic discussed today. We have repeatedly focused attention to the glorification of Nazism in Latvia and Estonia, the disgraceful phenomenon of mass statelessness, the violation of civil and political rights of Russian speakers, and the humiliating practice of testing people for loyalty. These bad examples have been followed by others. The authorities of Norway are also checking their citizens of non-Norwegian origin. For example, Dutch Council did not pass this kind of test and was dismissed from the Armed Forces service. And Mr. Nisilev did not even take the test. In various letters, the attempts to explain this said that Carlson and Nielsen were of Russian origin and could fall under Russian pressure. It looks like for Oslo, Russophobia is a modern form of discrimination, which is basically ethnic profiling. We are deeply concerned with the increased pandering in the EU to radicals and new nationalists and discrimination. In the Netherlands, following the example of West Germany, have decided to publish an annotated version of Mein Kampf. Official Ottawa, while denouncing with words all types of xenophobia, are also pointing fingers at others of inciting intolerance, does nothing to stop their own glorification of Nazis and criminals. For example, in one of the cemetery, monuments to neo-Nazis were established, as well as the Ukrainian Youth Service has also erected a monument to Shukevich, a war criminal. There were also memorials to Bandera followers who are also part of the Ukrainian nationalist organization SS Galichina. Here in Warsaw, on the 11th of November 2017, there was an independence march with 60,000 people who used fascist slogans as well as racist slogans, clean blood and Europe, which is only for white people. This was only denounced after negative media coverage that called this the largest fascist march in Europe. We also already talked about the bill in Ukraine, which would change the military charter, where slogans such as glory to Ukraine, glory to heroes, which is also a nationalist slogan which is used by the Ukrainian football teams. We're also talking about many organizations who have held many hundreds of racist acts in the west of Ukraine, have said that Human Rights Watch, International Freedom House, as all these are organizations, not to pay attention to them. We should like to suggest that OSCE should assess this type of whitewashing of fascism, as well as pursuing those who have killed people due to racism, as well as pandering to racism.
Thank you. I'd like to give the floor to the next speaker.
Уважаемый господин
Distinguished moderator, distinguished colleagues, civil society representatives, associations have a number of times expressed the importance of paying the greatest of attention to the growth of aggressive nationalism and neo-Nazism in the OSCE area. In the past few years, the Ukrainian authorities have adopted a number of legal and administrative acts aimed at whitewashing the activities and glorification of Nazi collaborators. The legal basis for promoting the activities of nationalistic forces in Ukraine is the law on the legal status of Ukrainian independence fighters in the 20th century, with references to the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists and Ukrainian Insurgents Army. For instance, the Kiev authorities consider the former head of the Lvov SS Division Galichina, Evgeny Kudzik, to be a freedom fighter. In the Lvov cemetery, there's a memorial to soldiers of the SS Galician division who fought in regular German fascist troops. Now, the article from this legislation was deleted that would have forbidden justifications of fascist crimes. Let me note that the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg called for recognizing all SS troops to be war criminals. They were responsible for war crimes and for the deaths of a tremendous number of people. I've just quoted the Nuremberg judges. In July of 2017, Freedom House presented a special report on far-right nationalism as a threat to a Ukrainian democracy. And from the end of 2017 and the beginning of 2018, there has been an increase in the number of the activities of far-right forces. According to Freedom House, National Corpus, Right Sector, the Volunteer Division of AUN, the Carpathian Network, and a number of other groups are to be classified as such. There have been in Latvia a number of meetings of veterans of the Waffen-SS. Now, it is, in fact, government structures that are increasingly participating in this process. For example, in the yearly report for 2017 of the Interior Security Service of Estonia, it is noted that Russian propaganda continues to be a factor in cultivating myths in Estonia about the liberating role of the Red Army during the Second World War. But this means that anyone who says the opposite from an official point of view is seen as taking a hostile position with respect to the country itself. Now, why? How is it possible that there can be such moral damage?
Floor over to the next speaker. Thank you. May I ask the next speaker to please take the floor?
Good morning, Madam Moderator, distinguished colleagues. My presentation today is on the discrimination against the protection of the rights of children. Children are the most vulnerable in society, and thus they need special attention and protection. This is especially with regard to the movement or detention of children under the Hague Convention on the Civil Legal Aspects of International Abduction of Children from 1980. A number of cases have shown the abuse of Article 12 of the Convention, which says that when there's an illegal movement or detention of a child, the child must be immediately returned. As an example, we can talk about Alexander Kessin, a Russian who, according to the media in 2017, came back to Russia and was afraid for the life and limb of her 4 children. The statement with regard to the return of the children was handed in by her husband in Germany. The German courts deemed that the children should be returned, but in 2018, under appeal, she was proved that the husband beat the children, and the former court decision was annulled. Also, Julia Gross, according to information in November of 2017, also was able to return a court decision with regard to her 2-year-old child, where it was said that even when she was pregnant, she was beat by her husband, and in appeal, she won the case. These examples show that in order to provide the protection of children and to eliminate any kind of discrimination against children, it is very important at the earliest stages, at the first consideration of the case, to ensure that all facts are established in the place where the child lives before the child is moved abroad. We also need to look at the living conditions of the child to provide for psychological and physical harm that the child may suffer as a result of biased decisions or as a result of disputes that are not solved by the courts. This could be helped by the cooperation by the country's administrative bodies and civil society. The NGOs of our countries could also make a significant contribution with regard to these processes. The Russian Federation, certain professional associations of legal experts are actively involved in these issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd now like to turn the floor to the next speaker.
Good morning. Thank you, Madam Moderator, for giving me the possibility to speak this morning. Today, fighting racism, xenophobia, intolerance, and discrimination remains a challenge for the international community, and eradicating these phenomena is only possible through joint efforts. The Kyrgyz Republic is a state in which for the past few years, we have managed to achieve a high level of cultural diversity in the context of a number of different peoples living in our society. Statistics show that there has been a further uniting of the Kyrgyz people, and clearly further development of interethnic harmony is based on integration under a plan that our government is instituting in order to create a general identity of our citizens and an identification with belonging to the Kyrgyz Republic. Peoples of different origins are able to unite. We are further developing our educational system with the active participation of parents and teachers. Recently, the High Commissioner for National Minorities visited Kyrgyzstan and recognized our policies as effective and appropriate to the conditions of our country. This is why we suggest paying special attention to education in integration processes. We have published a national report on our commitments with respect to eliminating all forms of racial discrimination and presented this report to the UN committee. We are drafting in our government agencies plans in keeping with our commitments. Representatives of different ethnic groups are represented in the parliament of the Kyrgyz Republic, and these individuals are also represented in our government agencies. We have solid anti-discrimination legislation, and in keeping with our constitution, in the criminal code of the Republic of Kyrgyzstan, we also have articles regarding hate crimes. We express the hope in continued cooperation with the High Commissioner, Lamberto Zanier, and other structures of the OSCE in supporting our efforts to ensure tolerance and to decrease discrimination and xenophobia in society. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to pass the floor to the next speaker.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am the head of the youth sector of Global Rights for Peaceful People. In Ukraine, there is a current government trend to force Russophobia on the people. In other words, hating anything to do with Russia. And this is basically dividing people, leading to enmity. The Ukrainian media and officials of the government are focusing on the fact that baseless propaganda in Ukraine is Russian propaganda, but dividing people into patriots and Russian bigots is nothing more than an extreme form of chauvinism. Self-identifying oneself as a Russian or any positive aspect with regard to Russia, Russian culture, from the viewpoint of Russian propagandists means that you are a second-class citizen. Chauvinism, Russophobia, intolerance from the Ukrainian authorities shows that the government officially approves this propaganda. The propaganda of hatred against Russian civilization, Russians, and all people who are dissenters, and to destroy the peaceful people in Donbass. The media in Ukraine are a platform for pushing forward this type of glorification. On the 11th of September, there was a site event here by journalists who spent over a year in Ukrainian prisons, who talked about the reality of the radical policies and methods to clamp down on any opposition thinking. This type of intolerance and Russophobia has become the main function of most of the media in Ukraine, which is controlled by authorities, special services, and oligarchs. We should recommend that ODIHR should focus on the open xenophobia of Ukrainian authorities, which is basically Russophobia, and to stop promoting it in Ukrainian media. Thank you.
I'd like to give the floor now to the next speaker.
My name is Daniel Glumov. I represent Interregional Social Movement for Democracy and Human Rights. According to the lowest estimates, Russian language is considered to be native and the only for about 7 million citizens of Ukraine. Yet this language is nowadays politically stigmatized and discriminated by the Ukrainian authorities. For example, the law of education adopted September 5th, 2017 and being implemented nowadays by Kyiv aimed to practically shut down all ethnic minority schools and convert them into completely Ukrainian, starting from the academic year of 2020-2021. Russians, being the biggest ethnic minority group of Ukraine, are discriminated by together with Hungarians, Romanians, Poles, Bulgarians, Greeks, and other ethnic groups. Yet in some regions of Ukraine, Russian language has already been claimed illegal and rancorous. Yesterday, September 19, the deputies of Lvov Regional Council, Rada, voted with 57 for, while 47 votes needed to pass, adopting the law that prohibits the use of so-called Russian language culture projects in the territory of Lvov region. As it's known, the local council also plans to create a special group on the monitoring of the law implementation process and work with people. What do the deputies of Lvov Regional Council mean by Russian language culture projects? These are plays and poems, shows and performances, books and movies, songs and other things related to the sphere. Every work of art is illegal in Lvov since yesterday if it's written, recorded, or performed in Russian. Just imagine here in Europe in the 21st century, something is prohibited just for the reason of it has been made in some language. War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky, Evgeny Onegin by Alexander Pushkin, all these internationally recognized masterpieces of world literature in general and Russian classics in particular are now violating the law adopted in Lvov Regional Council since they were written in Russian. Just realize it. You can be imprisoned just for keeping such books at home. Not even touching the classics of world literature, any single person could be arrested if he speaks Russian in Lvov region. This law opens a full range of opportunities for Ukrainian right-wingers and their supporters among the deputies to oppress ordinary Russian-speaking people of Lvov region as well, based on their native language. This eventually is a rude violation of all international laws considering the rights of ethnic minorities. This law certainly is discrimination, refers to the deepest and darkest pages of the history of humanity and should not be tolerated by civil society. The policy conducted by the Ukrainian government, for instance, certainly refers to the out-of-date assimilation practices of the 19th century, which also cannot be tolerated nowadays. We strongly recommend OSCE and the state of Ukraine to pay attention to this fact and force Kyiv authorities, as well as Lvov Regional Council directly, to check this law on the constitutionality of the main law of Ukraine and call it off after it. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to pass the floor now to the next speaker.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. The UK fully subscribes to the statement made by the representative of France on behalf of the EU, but I'd like to add some remarks in my national capacity. Hate crimes reflect on us as a society. Hate crimes can cause lasting physical and emotional damage. They can evoke despair, anger, and anxiety in victims, and they spread fear and mistrust in communities, thus weakening the glue that binds society together. They strike at the heart of our democracy and undermine the fundamental rights of equality and non-discrimination. The UK government deplores all forms of hate crime and is committed to tackling it. We treat all hate crime with equal seriousness. There is no place for treating victims differently regardless of their race, gender, ethnic origin, faith, age, disability, sexual orientation, or gender identity. To stand against one form of hatred, you must be against all forms of hatred. The UK has a strong legal framework in place with criminal penalties for offences such as incitement to racial hatred and for racially or religiously aggravated assault and criminal damage. We've also recognised the harm caused by hate on the internet, and we're committed to take action to reduce this harm. Despite the challenges we face, we've made considerable progress in addressing hate on the internet. Whether offline or online, we will continue to encourage greater reporting of all hate crime. We're committed to building confidence and making it easier for victims of hate crime to come forward and report what has happened to them. As part of this, we welcome the important role played by civil society and voluntary sector organisations, including through the use of third-party reporting services. We also strongly support the work of ODIHR to help participating states take practical action to combat hate crime. In line with this, and picking up on issues raised by the introducers, we were pleased to be able to support an expert roundtable on countering hate crime against migrants, organised by ODIHR and held in London in February this year. The meeting brought together experts from states, academia and civil society. However, as we all agreed in Madrid in 2007, the primary responsibility for addressing acts of intolerance and discrimination rests with participating states, including political representatives, and through an effective criminal justice system. Throughout the UK, our police forces continue to be alert to crimes being committed which are motivated by hostility or prejudice against individuals because of who they are. This includes crimes against members of all faith communities, and police forces are taking steps to safeguard people and property. In conclusion, we thank the Italian chairmanship for putting this important topic on the agenda for this meeting and the introducers for their opening remarks. The UK is fully committed to engaging with all actors to help build a more inclusive, tolerant and cohesive society, and to ensure that we live up to our OSCE commitments to combat all forms of discrimination. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to now pass the floor to the next speaker.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Austria fully aligns herself with the statement of the European Union and would like to add the following remarks. Austria puts high emphasis on the fight against racism and xenophobia, taking concrete measures on all levels, such as promotion of equal treatment, fight against stereotypes, and promotion of integration. As an example, it can be said that the criminal protection against discrimination and hate crimes has been strengthened considerably over the last years. The principle of equal treatment is established in the Austrian constitution. Based upon this, a comprehensive anti-discrimination legislation has been adopted, which is being constantly improved. In the field of administrative and civil law, the implementation of EU guidelines on the enforcement of anti-discrimination legislation has further strengthened the Austrian legislature. Furthermore, non-legislative measures are being taken as well, in particular in the field of education, training and awareness raising. These measures will be further increased and strengthened with the existing National Action Plan on Integration. Let me outline some of the key elements of Austria's response to hate crimes. Offences that can be categorized as hate crimes are detailed in the Austrian Penal Code. The Austrian Ministry of the Interior hosts a reporting point for hate crime-related incidents, where such incidents can be reported, including via email. Based on the facts which constitute the offence, the fact is attributed to a main bias, motivation. Hate crime data is collected and recorded according to specific types of crime found in the Criminal Code. The Austrian Penal Code contains a general sentencing enhancement for bias-motivated crime that is applicable to nearly all crimes. When making a complaint, each victim is informed about their rights. It includes the right to be represented by someone else, to receive a written confirmation of the complaint, and most importantly, the right to receive an assessment of worthiness of protection as soon as possible, as well as the right to make use of translators. Furthermore, the victim is informed about the possibility to use psychological and legal process support about the offers of various aid organizations. Austria has introduced a variety of offices offering support and advice and/or monitoring, as well as some offering trainings and human rights education. These efforts are complemented by the work of a whole range of civil society organizations active in the fight against hate crimes. Let me also use this possibility to refer to the independent evaluation report on the implementation of selected OSCE human dimension commitments in Austria on the occasion of the Austrian OSCE chairmanship in 2017. The human rights institution performing the evaluation was also examining how Austria was addressing issues of hate crime, religious intolerance, extremism, and preventive human rights education measures. While attesting significant progress in developing actions to counter hate crimes and the legal framework, the report has also identified challenges such as addressing hate crimes on the internet. We are currently looking into how these recommendations can be addressed in a meaningful way. In closing, let me assure you that Austria will continue to actively engage in the fight against hate crimes and will work closely with international and regional organizations, including ODIHR, in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd now like to pass the floor to the next speaker.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I will talk in Russian.
The problem of discrimination remains a serious problem in Central Asia and Eastern Europe.
An NHRI?
Yeah, and Discrimination Center Memorial, yes?
Are you representing a civil society organization or an
Yes,
NHRI?
yes.
Okay, you need to sit at a civil society seat, please.
Sorry for that.
The problem of discrimination remains quite serious in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Some countries have anti-discrimination norms that are actively used, but most countries have not adopted comprehensive anti-discrimination legislation, and often vulnerable groups are facing discrimination. The most frequent kinds of discrimination are based on ethnic belonging, health status, gender, and these are kinds of discrimination that are general to all countries in the region. Women who are queer, LGBT, women who are disabled are doubly discriminated, and there are especially vulnerable populations of LGBT and national minorities in Central Asia. Based on gender identity and sexual orientation, people are persecuted in gray zones. I refer to Donbass and Crimea. These people suffer from discrimination, and there are discussions on the memorial website of these issues. We will be holding a side event in room 2. We invite you to join us. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to now pass the floor to the next speaker.
Добрый день, уважаемая госпожа.
Good morning, distinguished moderator, participants. I have come directly from Crimea to this meeting in Warsaw. Crimea, which today, in violation of international norms and intergovernmental agreements, the Russian Federation has occupied. Let me say that rather than statements on the part of Russian authorities on observing human rights and freedoms, there is a tremendous gap, a huge gap. Human rights defenders are constantly reporting violations of human rights, discrimination, as well as the fact that these deal with most of the areas that we're discussing here today. In a number of Eastern European countries, we hear the Russian Federation saying that Russian-speaking individuals do not enjoy equal rights. But the fact is that the Crimean Tatars are suffering in certain areas as well. For instance, there are two different classes for the study of the Ukrainian language, and Crimean Tatars are constantly facing problems. Quite recently, we faced situations when school administrations convinced parents not to use the right for their children to receive instruction in their own language. And so a number of children don't have the possibility of using their native language. There is discrimination based on political positions and political convictions. Russian authorities have not taken action in order to lift the ban on representativity of the Crimean Tatar people, and the chairman of that body is here in this room. There's constant persecution for political positions, for dissenting views with respect to the Russian Federation, and for posts in social media, even for poems which question the official position of the Russian state. We are forced constantly to react to this. And there are dozens of individuals who, because of their political positions and their civil society activeness, find themselves persecuted today. There will be a case opening in Crimea on an administrative case of a very famous doctor, a urologist, who is being accused of having literature which is illegal, and we will find out later today the outcome of this case. A number of times, statements have been made here about kidnapping of people, and in fact, relatives of those individuals have been here. We still don't know where those who have kidnapped are located. We're constantly facing problems in exercising rights such as the right to hold peaceful assemblies. And if you, in fact, as an individual, are not loyal to the current authorities, and if you cannot dissent from the prevailing views of the Russian Federation, then you, in fact, do not have the right to make statements in the media, and you are discriminated against. With respect to the statements that have been made about a renaissance of Nazism and in countries of Eastern Europe, let me make a remark. In the school where my child studies, there is a map of the various genocides of peoples in the Soviet Union. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. I'd like to give the floor to the next speaker.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. The International Federation for Human Rights, FIDH, welcomes and supports the efforts of the OSCE and participating states to combat racism, xenophobia, intolerance, and discrimination. Public expressions of hate, often referred to as hate speech, represent a serious problem as they can create environments that are conducive to hate crimes. Criminalizing such expressions has become an important part of combating xenophobia and discrimination. However, the selective application of such laws might lead to a climate of social acceptance of violence against certain vulnerable groups, and their misuse to the excessive restrictions of free speech and repressions against the civil society. FIDH wishes to draw attention to abuses of Article 282 of the Criminal Code of Russian Federation, which criminalizes any action aimed at incitement of hatred or enmity, as well as humiliation of human dignity, such as posts on social networks. The vague formulation of the law accords law enforcement a wide discretion in its implementation. In 2017 alone, the Prosecutor General opened over 450 cases for reposts and likes on social networks, where potential violators face up to 5 years in prison. The major activity of law enforcement fighting hate crimes under this provision thus entails surveillance of social networks, resulting in prosecution of statements which are, although offensive or shocking, do not lead to or incite violence. At the same time, prosecutors consistently refuse to institute proceedings under Article 282 for statements advocating violence with respect to Russia's LGBT community, which suffers state-sanctioned persecution, discrimination, and often violence with impunity. By contrast, under the guise of combating extremism and xenophobia, a large number of prosecutions are instituted for political statements which, among others, question the legality of actions of the Russian authorities, including those of the armed forces and the quality of work or public servants or police. One of the most vivid examples of such abuse is prosecution of poet and former teacher Alexander Byshov. He lost his job as a teacher and was sentenced to community service, including under Article 282, for inciting hatred against Russians in his poems posted on the internet that criticize Russia's actions in Ukraine and Crimea and praise Ukrainian resistance to foreign aggression. As to recommendations, FIDH urges the OSCE to recommend that Russia amend the statute to change its vague formulation in compliance with international law standards. Secondly, to limit the selective implementation of the law, particularly to prosecuting incitement of hatred and violence against vulnerable groups, and to stop political persecutions, in line with the recent decision of Russia's Supreme Court. Thirdly, to the extent that there is no consensus in the OSCE region on the limits of the freedom of expression with regard to statements motivated by hatred and prejudice, we recommend that the OSCE form a working group with the view to elaborating relevant guidelines. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd like to pass the floor to the next speaker.
I am Frederick Omoy Madurge, representing the Nelson Mandela Human Rights Association. What is called colonialism in Africa is what I call the genesis of terrorism. Today, we have a new dimension of colonialism as African leaders continue to impose themselves in power and to steal and hide money in European banks. It took Switzerland 20 years of litigation and foot dragging before they reluctantly repatriated $1.4 billion stolen and hidden in their banks by the late Nigerian military head of state, General Sani Abacha. Interest from that amount was lost. Report shows that $1 trillion is stolen yearly by African leaders and hidden abroad, while Africans desperately try to escape from their various countries through the Mediterranean Sea. Today, Nigerian senators earn more than any European president because they ingeniously appropriate emoluments and earnings to themselves against national and international law. It is forbidden under paragraph 2 of Article 8 of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption for public officers to engage in self-dealing with emoluments that are unacceptable under international law. Nigeria is signatory to that convention. What Nigerian senators earn in 4 years is enough to build 18 hospitals in each of the 36 states of Nigeria. Sadly, President Muhammadu Buhari of Nigeria has spent 107 days in the United Kingdom to seek medical treatment without publicly disclosing his expenses, which he took from national treasury. This is a government purportedly fighting corruption. Therefore, it is imperative on behalf of the European Coalition for Security and Democracy in Nigeria to recommend as follows. 1, that the EU and other countries must stop banking stolen money from Africa. 2, that the EU and other countries must seriously consider placing travel bans on Nigerian senators and their families. 3, all financial assistance to Nigeria must be urgently reviewed. We receive financial assistance, we borrow, we receive astonishing revenue, We have unmatched natural resources, yet we have become the poverty capital of the world as 6 Nigerians slide into poverty every minute, while 44 Indians get out of poverty every minute. Lastly, we, Africans, must begin to seriously hold our leaders accountable. Enough is enough. Thank you.
Thank you. And I would like to remind the participants that this topic for this session is combating racism, xenophobia, intolerance, and discrimination, particularly addressing mechanisms to strengthen comprehensive responses to hate crimes by governments and civil society. So I would ask participants to please make your remarks relevant to this topic. I'd like to now pass the floor to the next speaker.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Burkhan Dufanif, the Movement of Equal Opportunities for All. Discrimination is something we all need to understand, and I will give you a number of examples. In 2017, in one of the orphanages in the area of Ferganfa, the children were raped and used for sexual services. Their customers also came from the special forces and the local government. Bloggers shed light on this crime, and the criminals were called to account. But the customers who were part of the government, their names were never publicized. Second example, in July of this year, in Samarkand, the police arrested 2 women. They were delivered to the police precinct. They were stripped. They were beaten. Everything was filmed with a smartphone. And then the video was publicized. All of this was done under the pressure of bloggers and human rights defenders.
That has been raised.
Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to clarify, how is this linked to today's topic? A direct link, because discrimination against women, against children is being discussed.
Yes, I recognize that the topic needs to address the subject at hand. I'll remind the participant that the statements do need to reflect the topic. Thank you.
Okay.
So, in an orphanage, if children are raped or violated, they are sexual slaves, that doesn't pertain to our topic, that would be nonsense. Next, I received information in that staff who had disabilities were involved in a forced labor to go and pick cotton.
Another point of order.
Madam Chair, I should like to request that the speaker should return to the topic under discussion so that we can come back to our topic, because other topics have been discussed for 2 weeks. This is not an appropriate recommendation.
I will remind the speaker that the topic does need to reflect comments related to combating racism, xenophobia, intolerance, and discrimination, particularly around mechanisms to address and strengthen comprehensive responses to hate crimes by government and civil society.
Okay.
When people are put on a list to go and pick cotton, these are people who have disabilities, physical disabilities. Madam Chair, I think it is inappropriate to continue to raise points of order to try to return the speaker to the discussion of the topic for today's session. For 2 weeks, we have been discussing these topics, and I believe that this presenter already had the opportunity to speak on this topic. And so I think that after the 3rd time of raising a point of order, I think we really need to come back to the topic.
One moment, please. I'll ask the speaker to immediately address the topic at hand, and if this is the last warning, so if the comments do not address the topic, I will pass the floor to the next speaker. Thank you.
Fine. Let's go on to statistics. So for the past year and a half, over 33,000 people in Uzbekistan obtained Russian citizenship. 4 to 6 million people, citizens of Uzbekistan, are labor migrants who earn a pittance. Over 100,000 Muslims were forced to leave their homeland, Uzbekistan, and now are in forced migration in the Middle East and Turkey and in other countries of the world. In other words, in their own countries, they do not have the right to realize themselves and their opportunities and to follow their religious beliefs. They can't come back home. But at the same time, there are people in the country who are being sought by Interpol. Madam Chair. Well, there have been warnings, there have been explanations about the topic we are here to discuss today, which is the topic on the agenda.
The speaker is discussing the topic at hand, so I will ask the speaker to make a concluding remark as your time is now concluded.
Okay.
Fine. Gafur Rahimov is on the sanctions list of the Ministry of Finance of the U.S. He is accused of being part of an international criminal group. Uzbekistan is taking back this citizen. Other people who are in Canada, Norway, and the U.S., they are not taken back. There's xenophobia in Uzbekistan. That is spreading fear and hatred of one's own people. I have finished. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to pass the floor to the next speaker.
Madam Chair, I am the Secretary of the Interreligious Council of Russia. This organization was created 20 years ago. The leading Russian religious organizations include the Russian Orthodox Church, 3 Muslim organizations, the Central Association of Muslims of Russia, of Tatarstan, the Mufti of Russia, 2 Jewish organizations in Russia, and a Buddhist organization. One of the most important areas of the Council's work is combating xenophobia, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and anti-Christian actions, as well as hate crimes. Our council is a unique platform where for 20 years we have had dialogue on this topic. It needs to be noted that the aim of our council is not to bring our doctrines closer, but to discuss the following. One of the way we work is through statements. For the past 20 years, we have issued over 50 statements. The lion's share of these statements pertains to the topics we're discussing today. For example, some of the statements have pertained to national enmity, ethnic enmity in 2010 after the Red Square demonstration of radicals. The Interreligious Council of Russia called upon the elimination of xenophobia and national enmity, and this call has been heeded. One of the things we do is to prevent anti-Semitism. Less than a year ago, in October of 2017, a bureau of our council took place in the Center of Tolerance and the Museum of Jewish Culture and Center of Moscow. Before the meeting, the Russian Patriarch Kirill met with Ben Lazar, the main rabbi of Russia. During the meeting, the rabbi noted that in Russia, anti-Semitism has been eliminated and stressed the work of the Russian Orthodox Church and the Interreligious Council of Russia as help in attaining this achievement. Many of our statements and appeals touched upon acts of violence and extremism. We condemned the terrorist acts that have taken place over the past 20 years in Russia on the basis of hatred, starting with the terrorist act on Dubrovka and the latest terrorist attacks in Russia in Kislar and in Grozny this year. One of the areas of our actions in order to prevent hate crimes, anti-Semitism, and xenophobia is to extend religious education. In 2004, we appealed to state bodies with an appeal to include theological studies. Now, this was a successful example. In 2015, this was done, and there is a council that supports PhD dissertations on theology. We're also looking at theological studies in schools. We think that this type of education will help us to prevent hate crimes and hate in general, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and crimes against Christians. We hope in this way will be prevented. In conclusion, I would like to underscore that the Interreligious Council of Russia brings together the leading religions in the Russian Federation, and our experience and cooperation has shown that our differences in religious thinking hasn't stood in the way of unifying our positions on the topic of preventing hate crimes and violence and enmity based on religious belief. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to pass the floor to the next speaker.
Esteemed moderator, delegates, and colleagues, my name is David Johns, and it is a true honor for me to be here with you today. I would like to thank you and the OSCE for providing me with this opportunity to talk about the work of the National Black Justice Coalition and our efforts to combat racism, homophobia, and hate crimes. The National Black Justice Coalition is the only civil society in the United States that is intentionally and unapologetically dedicated to both racial and ethnic equity and LGBTQIA, and same gender loving, a term I use to describe myself, equality. The National Black Justice Coalition is an important organization because there are some of us who have intersectional identities. That is, we face bias, discrimination, and sometimes are the victims of hate crimes because of our multiple, overlapping, socially constructed identities. The work we do is important because too often people assume that all African descendants, all African Americans to be specific, are the same, that we're heterosexual, able-bodied, and Christian, for example. But as long as there have been Black people, there have been Black LGBTQ SGL people. And it is important for us to highlight this fact to ensure that we can meet the needs of members of our community who were too often neglected and ignored. There are 3 recommendations, really requests that I have of the United States and every other delegate represented here. And they're designed to strengthen responses to hate crimes. My recommendations are designed to ensure, again, that we protect the fundamental human rights of all people, especially African descendants who are united globally in the challenge of overcoming the vestiges of colonialism, transatlantic enslavement, and white supremacy. First, I have a question. Have you heard about the murders of the 22 Black women, Black transgender women in the United States? No? Have you heard about the 7 unsolved murders of Black trans women in Jacksonville, Florida specifically? No? The fact that you might not have heard about these alarming statistics is because we need more robust and disaggregated hate crime reporting that acknowledges intersectionality. Every year in the United States, Black transgender women are murdered at an alarming rate. However, they are not always counted or considered. Such data collection and reporting is essential to ensure that we're protecting the members of our community who are most vulnerable and who are least likely to report having been the victim of a hate crime, racism, or homophobia. Second, we need culturally appropriate and inclusive training and professional development for first responders, like police officers or educators, so that they are equipped to provide safe space for all individuals. This is also so that they can improve their ability to ensure safety and equal protection for all individuals, especially those of us who come from racial, ethnic, and sexual minority communities. Finally, the government of the United States should invest in civil societies, nonprofit organizations like the National Black Justice Coalition, organizations that do the work of providing victims of racism, homophobia, and hate crimes with necessary support and services like counseling, legal, and social support. I hope that you all consider the National Black Justice Coalition a resource, really a partner in this critically important work. And remember that Fannie Lou Hamer taught us that none of us are free until all of us are free. And my hope is that we can get free together. I thank you very much for the gift of your time and attention, and I look forward to additional and meaningful action.
Thank you. I'd now like to pass the floor to the next speaker.
Thank you. In discussing the observance of the rights of people with disabilities, we must recall those territories which are outside of the control of Ukrainian authorities due to occupation by the Russian Federation. While in Ukraine there has been gradual development in the area of rights of people with disabilities, our initiatives do not reach parts of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions or Crimea. Russian military aggression and regular shelling have created tremendous stress and a humanitarian crisis and tragedy in cities and towns in eastern Ukraine. People with disabilities are an especially vulnerable group. It is almost impossible for people with disabilities to evacuate or to find shelter during artillery shelling. Imagine the experience of a young family in which both husband and wife are in wheelchairs and who live together with their son in a high-rise apartment. Imagine their experience when a hostile army shells their neighborhood. Most residents can leave the high-rise building and find shelter, but the couple and their son can only pray in fear. This is the situation of friends of mine with whom I remain in constant contact. Daily activities such as doing errands, going to government buildings to get one's pension, or going to the doctors become very complex under conditions of war. Accessibility in cities has become more difficult. There are, in fact, no accessibility programs being implemented, not to mention access to work, to study, and to participate in social life for people with disabilities. Under conditions of war and occupation, such issues are relegated to the last place in terms of priorities. It's also important to note that people with disabilities currently cannot count on any reforms or support from the government in the rest of Ukraine. We appeal to OSCE participating states to influence the Russian Federation to cease the occupation of the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts and Crimea. And on behalf of my colleagues in Donetsk and Luhansk, I will provide this text to the Secretariat. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to now pass the floor to the next speaker.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Tolerance and non-discrimination and effective fight against hate crimes are possible only in the framework of protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms, including freedoms of expression, peaceful assembly, and association. Hate crimes on ethnic and religious grounds, especially when promoted at state level, constitute serious security threat. If not addressed at an early stage, they may lead to crimes against humanity and atrocities. We are facing an alarming situation in our region, where racist and xenophobic public discourse and open encouragement of hate crimes is a state policy by the highest political leadership of Azerbaijan. In the conducive environment of absence of free media, restrictions against civil society, and silencing critical voices, anti-Armenian state propaganda leads to radicalization of society, in particular youth. The harsh reality is that the ruling elite in Azerbaijan derives its legitimacy by promoting identity-based hate crime targeting Armenians. Promoting of xenophobia and intolerance in Azerbaijan is of systemic nature and incorporated in the education system. Video from a state kindergarten in Baku, when the tutor teaches children that Armenians are enemies, is a case to the point. Their rare initiatives on reconciliation by some individuals or organizations are publicly condoned and silenced. European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance, the international monitoring body of Council of Europe, consistently highlighted in its country-specific reports the widespread negative official and media discourse in Azerbaijan and called upon its authorities to take appropriate measures in addressing daily discrimination and hate speech against Armenians. OSCE institutions need to fully utilize their early warning mandate through hate crime reporting, monitoring of cases of hate speech in media. The methodology used by ODIHR in gathering and reporting hate crimes is not conducive for identifying those hate crimes which may represent eminent threat to the security in the OSCE area. The challenges of radicalization, extremism and hate crimes remain unaddressed. We recommend the ODIHR to raise the efficiency of hate crime reporting tool with the view to address hate crimes constituting security threats. Educational materials should become subject of monitoring in context of addressing radicalization of youth. Another recommendation to the Office of the RFOM should monitor media against hate speech targeting ethnic and religious groups. Thank you, Madam Moderator.
Thank you. I'd like to pass the floor to the next speaker.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. The United Nations Human Rights Council, the Regional Office for Europe, represents its compliments to the delegations of the participating states to the OSCE and takes this opportunity to deliver a statement on the topic combating racism, xenophobia, intolerance and discrimination, and would like to highlight the human rights situation of people of African descent. In 2001, the World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia and Religious Intolerance in Durban created visibility for the victims of racism and racial discrimination. The Durban Declaration Program of Action acknowledged that slavery and the slave trade are crimes against humanity and that they should always have been so. Across the world, people of African descent, those who are direct descendants of the slave trade and those who recently migrated from the African continent to other regions, continue to face racism and racial discrimination generations after slave trade and colonialism. De facto structural discrimination and marginalization build on this legacy that is reflected in barriers to and inequality in the enjoyment of key human rights, such as access to quality education, health services, and housing. In Europe, people of African descent and other ethnic minorities face rising racial hatred and acts of violence that is directed in many cases against migrants and refugees. In order to overcome racism and racial discrimination, the United Nations has proclaimed the International Decade for People of African Descent to be observed from 2015 until 2024. It's a timely and unique opportunity for member states to highlight the human rights of African descendants and support their human rights. The UN Human Rights Regional Office for Europe would like to commend OSCE for its important engagement in the area of non-discrimination, and we would like to make the following recommendations. First of all, that ODIHR should stress and continue to host and have trainings for people of African descent, especially activists. I was at the training yesterday, and we really would like you to recommend to continue this. It was very valuable. We further recommend OSCE participating states to launch the International Decade for People of African Descent, to implement the Durban Declaration Program of Action, and also to implement the provisions of ICERD. Finally, we recommend participating states to adopt and strengthen national, regional, and international legal frameworks for the protection of the rights of victims of racism and racial discrimination. Furthermore, we recommend to OSCE participating states and the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights to cooperate with the special procedures of the UN Human Rights Council that monitor the human rights situation of people of African descent, especially the UN Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent and the Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Religious Intolerance. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd like to pass the floor to the next speaker.
Good afternoon, everybody. Respected representatives from the OSCE ODIHR, governments representatives, and colleagues from civil society organizations. I want to express my great gratitude to ODIHR for the invitation and opportunity to be part of this conference, and to mission of OSCE in Skopje for continuous support in our efforts to tackle hate crimes and intolerance. I am here on the behalf of the Macedonian Helsinki Committee for Human Rights, which is the only organization in my country
I have
that...
a point of order.
I recognize the point of order.
Thank you. I wish to remind that according to the OSCE Permanent Council Decision number 81, 1995, this NGO is registered to a state that was admitted to the OSCE as a participating state under the provisional international denomination of the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. The decision states that this state will be provisionally referred to all purposes within the OSCE as a former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, pending settlement of the difference which was arising over the name issue of the state. Upon its entry into force of the Prespes Agreement, signed on 17th of June, a new chapter will open in the relation of the two neighboring states. Thank you.
Can I please ask the speaker to confirm if the name of the organization displayed on the screen is the name that you are currently registered under for the HDIN?
Yes, because that is our registered name in our country in the central register. That's why we registered like that, but
I'll return the floor to you then to conclude your remarks, as participants can only speak in the name of the organizations under which they have registered for HDIN.
thank you. I'm here on behalf of the Macedonian Helsinki Committee for Human Rights, which is the only organization in my country that since 2013 is registering and reporting on hate crimes incidents. In these 5.5 years, we've produced 5 annual reports which show that actually we are a very intolerant society, that instead of using diversity to grow and become better, we are abusing it for mutual hatred and intolerance. The report for 2015 shows that 1/3 of the registered hate crime incidents are hate crime motivated of the offender's bias towards victims, victims with a refugee migrant status. In 2017, Helsinki Committee has identified and registered 70 hate crimes incidents, and most of them are motivated by the ethnic or political affiliation of the victim or the perpetrator. Even more worrying is the fact that in many of these acts, minors and young people are involved. In the criminal justice system, many of these incidents end with the qualification as misdemeanor instead as a criminal offense, which led to demotivation of the victims and distrust in the system. For example, in the past 3 years, there is not a single incident registered that is motivated of the sexual orientation of the victim, which doesn't mean that suddenly our society become more tolerant towards LGBTI community. On the contrary, the reason for this is that beside of the positive political will of the new government, several hate crimes incidents reported to the police and public prosecutor's office since 2013 and 14 remained uninvestigated, unprosecuted, and without conviction. We commend the government's commitment for changes in the criminal code towards incrimination and appropriate qualification of hate crimes, but still there is a lot more to do, and government and criminal justice institutions must ensure prompt and effective investigation and prosecution of hate crimes, take appropriate measures to facilitate the reporting of hate crimes by victims, including measures to build trust in the police and other state institutions, collect and publish comprehensive and comparable data on hate crimes, ensure that victims of hate crimes are supported and protected, conduct trainings for relevant practitioners coming into contact with victims of hate crimes, and enhance preventive measures, inter alia by taking steps, for example, to educate the public about the values of cultural diversity and inclusion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd like to pass the floor to the next speaker.
Добрый день.
Good morning. Maxim Vilkov, the coordinator of the Information Group on Crimes Against the Person. Once again, I would like to draw the attention of the meeting to the problem of the dissemination of discrimination and the assimilation practices in Eastern Europe based on ethnic and linguistic characters. The lack of any kind of reaction from the international community to the discrimination of Russian speakers in Eastern Europe is on the rise and has been, and the hate speech and aggression against Russian speakers has been on the rise. Of course, here we're talking about what happened in Latvia, where up until now, for over 25 years now, there's an absolutely outdated law from the Middle Ages, I would say, the right against civil liberties and the right to use one's own language. Last year, a law on education in Latvia was passed, transferring all education into the Latvian language. We can all imagine that this action would give preference to Latvian children and would put Russian-speaking children at an absolute disadvantage and vulnerability. This is very clear from investigation into child psychology, which shows that information is best assimilated when it is presented in one's mother tongue. These laws are being introduced using Russophobic justification, saying that Russia is a threat. Using their political interests, Latvia and many countries from the European Union are motivating their citizens to fear the Russian threat, which is one step away from hating all things Russian. The saddest thing is all of these appeals have been heard in this hall today, where we have been meeting. In other words, the British Chatham House in this session is holding sessions on the issue of the looming Russian threat. Others are boosting the hatred in Ukraine towards the inexistent Russian threat. All of this is spreading. This has already meant that in Ukraine we have the growth of neo-Nazism, fascism, and hate-motivated crimes. I call upon the international community, the OSCE, and the European Union to thoroughly monitor cases of discrimination against people based on their ethnic group and linguistic group, so that we can eliminate this practice, at least in the European Union. I call upon Latvia to abolish their education and civil laws in the area of education, because in the 21st century in Europe, having such laws is unacceptable.
Thank you. I'd like to pass the floor to the next speaker.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I will refer to hate crimes against LGBT in Belarus. According to official statistics,
based on our data, we have information of over 100 incidences due to LGBT hatred in 2011-2018. At least 12 victims have sought assistance from the police in that period. Nevertheless, the official position of Belarus is for wholesale negation of these incidences, as we've seen from the 5th periodic review on Belarus and the civil and political rights of the UN. There are no training programs in the Belarus for the police to investigate hate crimes, not only on sex orientation or gender orientation crimes, but overall. Even if victims go to the police, they can face obstacles to the pressing of charges. The police often don't take seriously such charges, and they are turned away and discouraged from pressing charges. The typical wording of the refusal: absence of elements of a crime, even when people have been attacked or beaten. Often the victims are humiliated and are treated with offensively by the police, and the criminals are often have the sympathies of the officials. This is why victims are loath to talk about what happened to them, and attackers remain unpunished. This results in these crimes remaining dormant in an environment of impunity. Even if there's investigation and it comes to a court, the motive of the crime of homo or transphobia are not considered to be aggravated elements. Only once did the courts in Belarus recognize that there was a hate crime. But since that time, in February 2016, this approach has not become a regular practice. And some recommendations. In order for the OSCE would like to see that should be more attention to LGBT-motivated hate crimes, and for Belarus to introduce training programs for law enforcement with regard to investigate hate crimes based on homophobia and transphobia, and also proper treatment of victims, and to use methodology and to provide for assistance with regard to investigating hate crimes. Thank you.
Thank you. And also, as we are nearing the end of the speakers list, I would also like to remind participating states that if they would like to exercise their right of reply, to please see my colleague sitting directly behind me to note that you would like time to speak. And now I'll pass the floor to the next speaker.
Thank you. Vielen Dank, sehr geehrter Moderator.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. Ladies and gentlemen, the manifestations of discrimination and intolerance, including hate crimes, continue to pose a serious threat to peace and security across the OSCE region. This is also a matter of serious concern, that is, that today an entire people continuously become the target of discrimination, intolerant discourse, and hate crimes that can escalate into wider-scale conflict and violence. Over the past years, propaganda of hatred and intolerance in Azerbaijan towards everything Armenian has reached an unprecedented scale. The fact that the situation has reached a critical point is indicated by the following. Armenians have been declared the main enemy of Azerbaijan, and there are Azerbaijani children from preschool age are taught to hate Armenians. There are videos that have been taken of this by activists. Another example from German radio is the fact that classic works of literature have been, for instance, presented positively, saying that these two peoples, the Azerbaijanis and the Armenians, can live together. And this has led to the author becoming a public enemy number one. Their family lost their jobs, and the author risked being mutilated. He was told that his genes would be examined to see if he was not infected by Armenian genes. Another example is that of an Azerbaijani officer who committed a hate crime, killing a fellow Armenian officer during NATO language courses in Budapest, and he was made a hero and role model in Azerbaijan. After being extradited, he was then freed, and there is a very well-known football team, Dortmund, and there is an Armenian player in this team. And recently, this information was published. The football club was worried that the Armenian would play in a certain match because they thought he would be injured, so he could not take part in the match. All of these examples demonstrate the extent to which the government has gone very far and created fear on the part of people. Now, this conference, ladies and gentlemen, is perhaps the only opportunity for civil society to speak about these issues to OSCE participating states. That is why I call upon you to condemn such atrocities and to condemn this intolerance and to find diplomatic means to stop the propaganda of hatred and xenophobia on the part of the Azerbaijani government. We know the danger of these policies when books are burned and when... Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd like to pass the floor to the next speaker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, representatives of OSCE institutions, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Yashar Yasharov, and today I represent NGO LIL, a Roma civil society organization based in the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. The OSCE participating states have recognized the danger of ethnic hatred targeting Roma and Sinti as early as the 1990s. In fact, they were the first intergovernmental organization to do so. In 2003, the OSCE adopted the revolutionary at that time action plan for improving the lives of Roma and Sinti within the OSCE region. This document has since then served as a source of inspiration for creating many policy programs for Roma and Sinti. Nonetheless, somehow, many, including myself, feel that the political will of participating states has since then gone to a large scale of stagnation. They, moreover, utterly fail at fulfilling the commitments they have once made. Chapter 3 of the Action Plan for Roma and Sinti is dedicated to combating racism and discrimination. However, we today still witness that all too often Roma and Sinti are subject to racist violence, they experience hate crimes, and are discriminated on a daily basis. What is even more frightening is that there are cases where we have noted acts of violence coming not only from individual citizens, but also, at times, by state authorities, in particular by police officers. We have seen attacks on Roma and Sinti camps and dwellings, and assaults against Roma and Sinti individuals that have also led even to death. Furthermore, hate crimes against Roma and Sinti are often not investigated properly. Racist motives are often ignored in the cases of violence against Roma and Sinti communities. In one participating state, for example, there was a pure act of hate crime which was recorded by the perpetrator himself. This act was first deemed by the state authorities as an act of hooliganism. And only after severe advocacy at the national and international level has this case seen the light of day and sentenced properly. I will therefore, like many others, urge the participating states to not dismiss cases of hate crimes against Roma and Sinti, but rather take a proactive approach in investigating them and utterly condemning them for what they are. I further urge the participating states at adopting clear legislation addressing hate crimes, as many have yet to do so. Among these lines, I would also like to recommend that the contact point for Roma and Sinti issues within the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights is utilized further by the participating states themselves in not only seeking advice, but also services, such as the well-developed training on effective human rights compliant policing in Roma and Sinti communities. In addition, I recommend that the contact point for Roma and Sinti issues develops and implements national and regional training courses for civil society organizations on identifying and addressing hate crimes. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to pass the floor to the next speaker.
Dear participants, the goal of my organization is promoting LGBT rights in Ukraine. Our specific interest is monitoring violations of LGBT rights, monitoring hate crimes, assisting victims of such crimes, and advocacy. We also publish annual reports, and I brought the latest report, which is called On the Rise, and it definitely says the situation in Ukraine, which we achieved real and significant progress in achieving LGBT rights after Revolution of Dignity, or so-called Euromaidan, which happened in 2014. But we also illustrated this publication with a photo which was taken during Eurovision Song Contest, which was in Kyiv in spring 2017. We have quite a big and very grey monument, so-called Arc of Friendship between Russia and Ukraine. And some art group decided to do a project and paint this arc with some different colors. At the same time, some extremist religious groups decided that it will be a rainbow symbol, and it stopped. So it appeared half rainbow, half gray. But it shows probably the best example of the situation of LGBT people and in Ukraine. So some progress, but not enough. I would like to say that a good example that we for already several years, 4 years, we have much of equality, or actually gay pride in Kyiv. And the last pride it was absolutely safe. The police made great efforts to make it safe, and it was more than 4,000 participants at this march. At the same time, in 2015, our president and then government adopted a national human rights strategy, and it also has an item of necessary to improve and introduce good legislation on counteracting hate crimes, also including against LGBT people. But unfortunately, until now, it is not realized. So my first recommendation for Ukrainian government, please continue to do your efforts on promoting LGBT rights. Please develop and introduce this necessary legislation, and please be vocal about LGBT rights. So it is very important in fighting with this phenomena in society. And my recommendation for OSCE, please include LGBT human rights in your agenda. It is very important. You are a strong organization, and you should give example to all member states about this issue. And finally, I would like to say that it is global trend that LGBT people will become equal members of the society. We see it in Northern America, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, South America, India, Australia. So, but we are still a vulnerable group. Please help us to achieve full equality. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to pass the floor to the next speaker.
Yes, good afternoon, Madam Moderator, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me to make a statement on behalf of the Council of Europe. The European Convention on Human Rights, the centerpiece of the Council of Europe's normative acquis, is of relevance for the protection of national minorities because its universally applicable individual rights can also be claimed by persons belonging to national minorities. Relevant provisions include the freedom of thought, conscience and religion, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly and association. Its Article 14 prohibits discrimination in the enjoyment of the rights guaranteed by the Convention, and its Protocol 12 contains a general prohibition against all forms of discrimination. The question of national minorities became a priority concern during the early 90s, with the rise of extreme nationalism and the outbreak of interethnic violence, which made it clear that the protection of national minorities is not only a crucial element of human rights, but also essential for stability, security and peace. At the first summit of the Council of Europe in Vienna in 1993, the heads of state and government responded to these developments by launching both standard-setting and cooperation activities aimed at protecting persons belonging to national minorities and combating racism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism and intolerance. The increased attention given to minority issues resulted in a range of concrete achievements during the 90s, including the adoption of the first legally binding national minorities instrument, namely the Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities, as well as the European Charter for Regional or Minority Languages, with effective monitoring mechanisms coupled with targeted cooperation activities to support member states. The Convention and the Charter are the two instruments with direct relevance to the protection of national minorities, the former as an individual rights instrument, the latter as a tool for the protection of regional or minority languages as part of Europe's cultural heritage. The Framework Convention is the only legally binding instrument in the world that protects the specific rights of persons belonging to national minorities as an integral part of human rights. With ratifying the Convention, states assume the obligation to safeguard the rights of persons belonging to national minorities to, for example, preserve and develop their cultural and linguistic identity, media and education rights, and promote the use of minority languages in public life. The Framework Convention also contains general principles related to non-discrimination and the promotion of full and effective equality for persons belonging to national minorities. The European Charter for Regional or Minority Languages is the only legally binding instrument in the world for the protection and promotion of traditional regional and minority languages. It lays down the aims and principles for the regional and minority languages spoken on a given territory, which are to be the state's long-term policy targets. The Charter contains specific provisions for the languages identified by the states at the time of ratification. The undertakings entered into by the states under these provisions require the latter to adopt concrete measures for the protection and promotion of regional and minority languages in several public fields. Also at the Vienna Summit, the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance was created, which is an independent human rights monitoring mechanism. This body makes country-specific recommendations and thematic policy advice on a number of topics ranging from anti-Semitism to Islamophobia to Romophobia and LGBT rights. Other activities in this field with regard to the integration of minorities and the fight against racism and anti-discrimination include the Council of Europe's programs in the field of intercultural cities, the No Hate Speech Youth Campaign, and the combating of discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation or gender identity. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you much for your attention, and I refer you to the written contribution on the Council of Europe website which has been posted on the HDM website for any further information. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to ask the next speaker to take the floor.
Fellow humans, thank you for the opportunity to speak on combating hate crime, racism, and xenophobia. I speak on behalf of NPAT, a European Network of People of African Descent. We are a network of 20 civil society organizations across 10 different European countries. We are Black-led, intersectional, and transnational, and we work towards the elimination of anti-Black racism and for the political empowerment of people of African descent in Europe and beyond. As NPAD, we call for more specialized attention to the human rights situation of migrants and refugees of African descent in the OSCE member states. Migrants of African descent encounter many breaches of their basic human rights, are exposed to hate crime, racist attacks, and overall lack of human decency towards them. We would like to see the member states of the OSCE, especially the European countries, to proactively seek for their particular role in ending this human rights crisis. We underline that these efforts must be accompanied by a serious, fully committed, and in-depth tackling of Afrophobia and anti-Black racism in the OSCE member states and beyond, which hold people of African descent as at an increased risk of being exposed, exploited, brutalized, trafficked, murdered by state agents, by Afrophobic groups, by political parties, and/or ordinary society members. We also note and underline that unpaid coerced labor of people of African descent, especially refugees of African descent, without the provision of the most basic needs such as water and food, kidnapping and forced prostitution take place in OSCE member countries. We welcome the gathering of statistical data, as done so, for example, by ODIHR or other equality bodies, and encourage those institutions to consider people of African descent as a distinct group and pay attention to the intersectional character of hate crime and racist attacks that they have to endure. We also recommend national action plans, and we've already heard that there are frameworks in place that can help to set those up for people of African descent, also with a special consideration of refugees of African descent to give this urgent matter the needed attention. And we encourage the national government to find measures of self-control by including people of African descent in a meaningful way in their institutions and by listening to the people of African descent community that already organizes to countervail these types of violence. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to pass the floor to the next speaker.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I represent the Social Action Center, an organization working in Ukraine, striving to support victims of hate crime and combat discrimination. The statement will refer to the examples of particular hate crimes, but the recommendations concern all groups suffering from bias-motivated violence in this regard. In solidarity with the Roma Rights Group and the Coalition of Roma Civil Society Organizations in Ukraine, I would like to express concern about the course of investigation of attacks on temporary Roma settlements that are qualified without relevant aggravating circumstances. One case, an attack which happened on May 9th in Lviv, a Ukrainian city, was closed after a certain time of investigation. I would also like to point out positive developments that follow these tragic events. I would like to welcome the announced initiative to dedicate specialized detectives working on hate crimes across regions in Ukraine. I would like to commend the cooperation between the police and the Ministry of Interior with Roma organizations immediately after the attacks. I would also like to point out the positive development in the form of working groups and a prompt response by patrol police that had saved the life of the victim's brother in the city of Lviv. At the same time, there are several recommendations that I think would be helpful to improve the response in Ukraine and that can be used already today to make sure that tragic events like these do not happen again. To the state of Ukraine, I would like to recommend that all branches of the national police cooperate and effectively investigate the crimes against different groups. The national police and the national authorities have to make sure that combating hate crime is a clear priority throughout the entire police system. We cannot have the patrol police try to catch the perpetrators and later on investigators forgetting a biased motive. It should be clear throughout the entire process. It can be clear through recommendations developed by the investigations department. It can be clear through instructions, and first and foremost through political will and the message within the system that these crimes need to be investigated. Secondly, to the international community, I would like to recommend directing attention to the state of investigation. Condemning is important, but it also is important to follow up on how hate crimes are investigated and what message the states send to the people who suffer from hate crime. To the ODIHR, I would like to recommend to continue efforts and continue dedicating resources and building capacity within Ukraine of the police and civil society organizations. I would like to especially recommend continuing to work on dialogue between civil society and police and improving the response in that matter. And lastly, to improve the mechanism to the states, all participating states of the OSCE, need to improve the mechanisms to support victims of hate crime, their families, their next of kin. In the memory of David Pap, a 24-year-old Roma, who lost his life this June for nothing else but being born as a member of a particular ethnic group, I would like to urge all participating states to consider the victims as the first priority in investigation of hate crime. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll now pass the floor to our last speaker on the speakers list.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I will speak in Italian. L'Italia si allinea
Italy aligns itself with the statement made by France on behalf of the European Union and would like to add some information in a national capacity. Italy places great importance on preventing and countering hate crimes, incitement to hatred, while respecting freedom of expression. Italy fully subscribes to respecting and promoting OSCE commitments in the human dimension, including on tolerance and non-discrimination. Over the years, Italy has created legislative and operational instruments to counter discrimination, racism, xenophobia, and hate crimes. The Italian Constitution and the legal system condemn any form of racism or discrimination. For example, Article 604 bis of the Criminal Code sanctions any crime of propaganda or instigation of crimes based on racial, ethnic, or religious discrimination. At the operational level, Italy has important national instruments such as the Observatory to Counter Discrimination, the National Office Against Racial Discrimination, the Parliamentary Commission on Hate, Intolerance, Xenophobia, and Racism, which was renamed the Joe Cox Commission, and the Working Group on Combating Hate Crimes within the Ministry of Justice. Monitoring of discriminatory behavior, including online, has been enhanced through awareness-raising campaigns on the correct use of social media, such as, for example, the following projects, which I will say in English.
Empowering and supporting victims of anti-LGBT hate crimes. Call it hate, raising awareness of anti-LGBT hate crimes.
What is more, Law 212 of 2015 defines and refers to vulnerable victims, including individuals who are the victims of racial hate crimes or who have been discriminated against. Any protection involving structures that do not belong to the judicial system, contacts with qualified persons who can immediately identify the seriousness of the events or the need for adopting measures of protection, or to call on other bodies to provide assistance to the victim, as well as limiting contacts between the victim and the authorities of public ministries. With respect to preventing hate crimes, within the OSCE, Italy has established a strong partnership with ODIHR, with the Catholic University of the Holy Heart in Milan, and the Order of Milan Lawyers. I invite you to the side event, which will take place this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I have a short statement. Instead of withdrawing its troops from occupied lands of Azerbaijan and getting involved in constructive negotiations, Armenia promotes and upholds hate speech against Azerbaijan. This is an integral part of the hatred ideology of the leadership of Armenia for many years. And in Armenia, people such as the Nemesis movement, Melkonyan, and Garagan Nijda are declared national heroes of this country, which is a clear evidence of xenophobia in the Armenian society. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll now open the floor to participating states for their rights of reply. The first speaker on the list will be Albania, followed by Latvia, and then Estonia. And you'll each have 1 minute and 30 seconds for your rights of reply.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I would like to use the right of reply to the so-called movement for the Renaissance of North Epirus, because in their presentation today and during the 2 weeks of HDM, they have presented disinformation and deformation of the Greek minority reality in Albania. The reality of Greek minority in Albania and other nations' minority in my country is quite different. The so-called movement for Renaissance of North Epirus, because they do not operate in Albania, are not aware of the development in the respect of the rights of minority in my country. Albania has positive records and keeps committed to fulfill the international obligation for the respect and protection of human rights and minorities. Albania has ratified several conventions on the human rights, as well the Framework Convention of Council of Europe for the protection of national minorities. A climate of respect and tolerance prevails generally in Albania, and inter-ethnic relations remain good due to the respect and protection of the rights of the national minorities. This has been confirmed by the reports of the international organizations such as OSCE, Council of Europe, European Union, and other organizations. The Albanian government is committed to respect the rights of the Greek minority in Albania, and we consider the Greek minority not only a genuine breach of our long-standing
May I please
friendship,
ask the speaker to conclude?
Oh, sorry. While inter-ethnic relations continue to be good, Albania significantly improved legal and political framework. We recently have adopted a new law on minorities, and also the secondary legislation on its implementation to be adopted very soon from Albanian government, which aim to ensure the existence of the specific human rights of persons belonging to national minorities, even the road signs mentioned today on this session from the so-called movement for Renaissance of North Albania.
Something else that I
I'm
want
sorry,
to
I
add
need to pass
is
the floor
about
to the next
we
speaker.
We reject every kind of direct or indirect statement.
Madam, I'm
alerting
sorry, we
great
need to pass
Albania.
the floor to the next
Okay.
speaker, the government of
The full
Latvia,
statement will be
which will then
delivered.
be
Thank
followed
you
by
for
the
your
governments
time.
of Estonia and the Netherlands. Thank you.
Thank you, moderator. In reply to several NGO statements and statements by the Russian Federation, I will speak on the education reform in Latvia. I already spoke about the non-citizens issue on Monday. So the educational reform, this reform has been a part of a comprehensive education reform with the aim of raising the overall education quality in Latvia. But it is of essence to emphasize that during and after the reform, the national minority education programs will continue guaranteeing that the national minorities can preserve and develop their language and their ethnic and cultural identity. And the government will continue to support state-funded national minority education programs in 7 minority languages, including Russian. The proposed reform meets Latvia's international obligations, and Latvia will continue to guarantee the support for the preservation of cultural identity of minorities according to the Framework Convention. And shortly on the issue of allegations of neo-Nazist manifestations in Latvia, there are none. Latvia denounces Nazism and mourns its victims, and as a democratic country, Latvia respects and guarantees freedom of expression. 16 March is not an official Remembrance Day, and people on their own private initiative paid their respects to the fallen soldiers that were forcefully drafted in the Nazi army during the Second World War. And government officials and members of the government do not participate in those gatherings. And of course, usage of Nazi symbols is forbidden by law in Latvia. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll pass the floor next to Estonia, followed by the Netherlands and the United States of America.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Estonia would like to exercise the right of reply and respond shortly to some misleading remarks presented earlier in this panel. First, the Estonian constitution prohibits any discrimination on ethnic or any other basis. Estonia is one of the few countries where you can receive an education in Russian language at all levels, from primary school to university degree. The language of instruction is regulated only at the level of the upper secondary education, which is non-compulsory. We also support diverse media space and believe that this is what it makes it possible to have all voices heard. Estonia protects freedom of speech and freedom of information. These principles are followed by our institutions. According to World Press Freedom Index, Estonia stands on the 12th place. Second, let me repeat that the Estonian government has condemned the crimes and ideology of all totalitarian regimes in strongest possible terms. Estonia rejects and deplores any glorification of ideologies, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Estonia, as a member of International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, is helping to record the memory of Holocaust victims. Thank you.
Thank you. And I pass the floor to the Netherlands, followed by the United States and Hungary.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I would like to exercise my right of reply regarding the statement of the Russian delegation. The publication which raised the concerns of the Russian delegation is a translation of an earlier published German edition of Mein Kampf with scientific comments and numerous footnotes, pointing the reader to inaccuracies in the original publication. The book is recognized by historians as a scientific analysis of a historical text. Already in 2014, a judge in the Netherlands concluded that an outright ban of the sale of Mein Kampf in the Netherlands was outdated due to the simple availability of the book via the internet. Moreover, in the Netherlands, the New Israelite Weekly and the Dutch Center for Information and Documentation Israel, CD, have no objections to the publication of this critical edition of Mein Kampf. To the contrary, and I quote, "Since the historical awareness is diminished, we find it very relevant that the book is presented with context. The book is available everywhere on the internet, and it is especially important that a reader gets a good explanation." Unquote. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to give the floor to the United States, followed by Hungary and Lithuania.
Thank you very much. My delegation would like to thank the National Black Justice Coalition for their thoughtful and powerful presentation. The United States is committed to enforcing federal hate crime statutes, which allow prosecution of certain crimes committed due to the actual or perceived race, color, religion, national origin, gender, sexual identity, gender identity, or disability of any person. Our Department of Justice has ramped up prosecution of hate crimes and training of federal, state, and local law enforcement. However, we recognize that more needs to be done, and we will share the Coalition's recommendations with our authorities in Washington. Madam Moderator, it is presentations like this that make HDM such a valuable forum, and we welcome NBJC's participation going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll turn the floor next to Hungary, followed by Lithuania and Ukraine.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. In reply to the U.S. statement, I would like to add the following remarks. The government of Hungary is committed to develop comprehensive national responses to hate crimes and have adopted a range of commitments to take action against discrimination and crimes motivated by bias. The Ministry of Interior, the Prosecutor's Office, and the Criminal Police Department of the National Police Headquarters collect data on hate crime as a part of our general crime statistics. Based on these statistics, in line with our commitments, Hungary regularly reports hate crime data to ODIHR. In Hungary, several legislative measures contain conceptual elements which have a direct relevance to the concept of hate speech. The latest version of the Criminal Code and the Code of Administrative Offenses both include a number of criminal offenses that can have a direct relevance to hate crime and hate speech. The Civil Code provides protection for individuals against verbal abuse on the basis of belonging to a group that defines an essential part of her or his identity. Furthermore, the First Amendment of the Fundamental Law provided a constitutional guarantee that the freedom of speech can be curbed if its practice violates the dignity of a community. Moreover, in connection with this issue, we also would like to recall that as a result of the government's successful action, anti-Semitism in Hungary is not a problem. In contrast, in other regions of Europe, where this is still an increasing trend. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd now like to pass the floor to Lithuania, followed by Ukraine and Armenia.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I would like to respond to the remarks made by one NGO regarding education of national minorities in Lithuania. First of all, I would like to note that the misleading statement suggesting that a decision on the increased use of Lithuanian language in national minority schools is already adopted does not correspond to reality. As in every democratic country, in Lithuania, various initiatives are being brought up and discussed among different interlocutors, including from the civil society organizations. The same process is ongoing in this case. The mentioned initiative was proposed by 3 parliament members, and it was not even discussed yet. There also are some other initiatives on education currently being brought up. However, at this initial stage, we do not see any necessity to discuss it here. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to pass the floor to Ukraine, followed by Armenia and Azerbaijan.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. At the outset, we would like to thank representatives of vibrant Ukrainian civil society for their recommendations. Exercising the right of reply to the statement of Russian delegation and Gongos its control and their unfounded allegation directed to my country, I would like to state that Ukraine is among the countries who suffered most from the occupation by Nazi regime and its crime during the Second World War. The remembrance of enormous human losses of the Ukrainian nation and its contribution to the victory over Nazism informs Ukraine's consistent and strong position of condemnation of all forms of Nazism, neo-Nazism, and other practices fueling contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. The legislation of Ukraine condemns the crimes committed by Nazi and Soviet totalitarian regimes, which acted in allies unleashed in the Second World War II, and outlaws dissemination of the ideas and symbols. Before the Second World War II, the Soviet totalitarian regime under Stalin killed millions of Ukrainians through the human-made famine Holodomor, after whole nations like Crimean Tatars, Chechens, and others were deported under no grounds. Now Stalin is glorified in Russia. Now I switch into Russian.
The representative of the Russian Federation Social Council will answer in Russian. As a Ukrainian of Russian origin, myself, as millions of my co-citizens, is not a victim of discrimination. I love Ukraine, its history and land. My child, as millions of Ukrainian children, are taught in Russian. We have hundreds of thousands of schools which are bilingual. 355 students go to these bilingual schools. 2 million Ukrainians in Russia do not have access to schools in Ukrainian in Russia. NGOs from Ukraine are banned in the Russian Federation, and the only library of Ukrainian language was closed. We don't think that we should use the NGOs in a hybrid war. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to now pass the floor to Armenia, followed by Azerbaijan.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. In our statement, we presented facts well documented by relevant international organizations and reflected in their reports. Silence of the delegation of Azerbaijan in regard to these reports, which I referred to, confirms their relevance and the existence of a serious problem. We encourage the Azerbaijani delegation to take seriously the reports, concerns made by the international community in regard to the situation with tolerance and discrimination in the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll now pass the floor to Azerbaijan.
Thank you. With regards to the intervention by the Armenian delegation and its Congo, my delegation underlines that it's indeed disturbing that Armenia, the country that bears primary responsibility for unleashing war, committing aggression against Azerbaijan and committing other atrocious crimes and openly advocating racism ideology, attempts to lecture Azerbaijan on tolerance. It is a well-known fact that my country is a land of tolerance where hate speech does not simply exist towards any national or religious minority. Azerbaijani model of tolerance and multiculturalism is taught over 15 universities around the world. And we encourage the Armenian delegation to constructively engage in negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other participating states who would like to exercise their right of reply? In that case, I would like to thank our introducers as well as all of the speakers. Oh, no? No? Yes, okay. Yes, please go ahead.
Я приветствую всех.
I welcome all members. I'm Elena Berezhna. I'm the director of the Institute of Legal Policy in Kiev, Ukraine. I have listened.
Allow for participating states to exercise their rights of reply, not civil society. And you cannot be speaking from a delegation seat. In that case, I would like to thank again the introducers as well as all of the speakers on the speakers list for their comments and their thoughtful suggestions. I would also like to remind everyone that the side events will be starting at 1:15 and encourage you all to attend many of the thoughtful presentations that will be occurring over the lunch hour. For the next session, which will start at 3 o'clock this afternoon, please be reminded that the speakers list is open 1 hour before the session starts and that participants are advised to arrive early, as when we reach the limit of 50, the list is closed. Please also note that only participants present with their own badge can sign up to the list of speakers. If you could please all leave your headsets, receivers, and headphones in the room. And I also want to take this opportunity to give extreme thanks to our interpreters who have done a fantastic job of interpreting this session. Thank you all.